purpose of my visit, doesn't make sense anymore. But even in that same state, we visited other places. So, I'm not minimizing the problem, but I'm saying that acceptable that they actually terminated the visit and left. I'm sorry that my memory is so bad, but I just read it yesterday, so it should be in the news this week sometime. I wanted to say I like what Professor Huckabee gave you as resources, but there's also one that I wanted to mention. At my law school, we have, again, with extra budgetary support, we've set up a website that we call Anti-Torture Initiative. Well, I think actually the website is just called antitorture.org. But basically it is the webpage of the rapporteur, but it's the unofficial one, not the, because if you go to the OHCHR, that's really not user-friendly, to say the least. You have to dig and dig until you find what you're looking for. Whereas in ours, we not only have everything that I do officially, but also other things that are related, but perhaps an Amnesty International report that we think is important to put. So I think you'll find it more user-friendly. And anything on the rapporteurship on torture, at least, will be there as well. I really want to thank you for your attention and your questions. You were wonderful and supplemented all the gaps in what I should have said, but for your questions. So thank you very, very much.
I know some of you have to go for classes, so if you need to exit now, please do have people coming in as well for the next part of our discussion. Amazing. Actually, saying, a few of you had questions you didn't get a chance to ask, so we can, either if it makes sense at the end of this session coming up, we can do so, or after we can meet outside for a few minutes and Professor Méndez will answer questions too. So let's bring people out in the corridor. Thanks for waiting. Yeah.
Next one, you also went down there.
Rights and as a result of his involvement in representing political prisoners, was arrested and subject to torture and administrative detention for more than a year by the Argentine military. And during that time, Amnesty International adopted Professor Méndez as a prisoner of conscience, and he was expelled from that country in 1977 and moved to the United States. So timing is incredibly important here. Tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the release of the report Nunca, which is Never Again. It's a report of the investigation, documentation into the fate of the disappeared and other victims of human rights violations committed during 1976 and 1983 in Argentina. And so we're just extraordinarily fortunate to have Professor Méndez here to talk about the impact of that report and how you felt it had an impact upon the development of the field of transitional justice. And so we'll have a brief presentation followed by an open Q&A. Okay. Thank you again, Professor Méndez.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I really want to commend the Duke Law School and Duke University more generally for remembering to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the release of the report called Nunca. It's a great moment. It's very important to remember it. In Argentina, it has quite a bit of attention to it as well. Again, especially because the report has survived the test of time, and it has proven to be very accurate and very consistent, and also very helpful in not only in revealing the truth, which is a value in and of itself, but also in supporting prosecutions, in supporting the obligation to provide reparations to victims, etc. So the report is really important, and it's important if you look back and remember that it was done basically in less than a year. The investigation went on under the government of President Alfonsín for about 10 months. And it was conducted with almost no help whatsoever from the armed forces, because at the time, you may know, the armed forces had beaten a retreat from government, but they kept considerable strength. Fortunately, that has changed a lot in Argentina, but in those years, one, they retained power in an important way, not institutional power, but real power. And two, the emerging democracy was a little hesitant to push too hard, lest the military came back from the barracks and take over again. And it was a legitimate concern. I'm not saying that they were timid or cowardly. I'm just saying that it was uncharted territory. Not only in Argentina, but elsewhere in Latin America, there were many voices, and many voices in good faith saying, let's not push too hard here, because it can delay and even interrupt and reverse the transition to democracy. So, in fact, the investigation of CONADEP was done mostly on the basis of the testimonies of victims and their families, and mostly the families in this case. Because as you know, the mandate was on disappearances only. It was not a mandate to review all of the violations of human rights that the dictatorship had committed. It was only about disappearances, and particularly to settle the question of their fate and whereabouts, because that was the most burning question. Disappearances had been by far the most distinctive part of the repressive policies of the military. But for example, the report didn't say anything about arbitrary detention or prolonged arbitrary detention. It didn't say anything about torture unless it was known that the disappeared person had been tortured. And at that time, some testimonies revealed it. But the torture that happened in the regular process of interrogation of somebody who was not among the disappeared was not part of the mandate, so it was not covered. It didn't say anything about submitting people to trials by military commissions, for example, which was a relatively minor part of the pattern of repression, but it was there as well. So, in essence, the report was based on the families of the disappeared literally flocking to give their stories to the commission. And the commission set up shop in downtown Buenos Aires in a theater in the middle of the city, and for days and days people just waited in line to tell their stories. So I think what's important is that there was an awakening of democratic sentiment that now we can speak and we can say and we should use this space that we now have, when literally only months before, that space wasn't there. Because in the 7 years of the military dictatorship, it was dangerous, at least to say the least, to speak out. And in a sense, the attitude of going to wait in line to give their testimony was an offshoot of what the mothers of Plaza de Mayo and the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo had done, even in the worst period, when they literally stood. They couldn't say anything, but they stood in front of the government house every week, and they became a symbol of the phenomenon of disappearances. They started wearing their scarves, etc., white scarves. So it was something that the military had tried to hide, but because of them, they were unable to hide. And it's interesting then that the report, that is actually very well written, very factual. It doesn't add too many adjectives or adverbs. It basically says, this is what we found, and it's mostly based on what the victims told them. But in addition, there was so much support around the country for the commission that they were able, for example, to locate detention centers. Some of them had been known by testimonies given abroad during the dictatorship by people who survived and who identified, for example, the Navy Mechanics School, ESMA, as a site of a clandestine detention center. But surprisingly, there was so much outpouring of information and some ability to conduct searches in the democratic period that the Commission identified something like 350 detention centers around the country. Some big and some small, but all of them clandestine. All of them places where they disappeared had been taken and where torture happened with no limits or anything. And they also identified the methods of killing some of the disappeared, many of the disappeared. I think the reason we know so much about it is, among other things, because there are survivors. There were survivors at the time, and there are now some more survivors coming up. So we understand the phenomenon of disappearances a lot better now. But it's interesting that the more that we know, and nowadays you may know that there are ongoing trials in Argentina for the crimes of that area, and there are something like 1,200 persons either in custody, some serving, about 500 of them already serving sentences, and the rest either in pretrial detention or in house arrest or in some other form of being prosecuted while at liberty. So it's quite an accomplishment to be able to conduct so many trials. But what I think is important, and sometimes is forgotten, is that without the report of the Nunca Más report, the trials today, I don't think would have been impossible, but they would have been made much more complicated. Because, and I think this is a lesson that we apply almost everywhere where transitional justice happens and where governments try to reckon with the past by fulfilling the obligation to the truth, to justice, to reparations, and to institutional reform, we find then that truth-telling, truth-seeking and truth-telling is most useful when it is the way to open doors towards prosecution. And I think nowadays the debate about whether to do truth or to do justice is no longer an important debate, I don't think. But at the time of the transitions in Latin America, at least, there was a very vibrant and very strong discussion. And a lot of people said, you know, prosecutions are going to be messy, they're going to be complicated, let's just do truth. In fact, there's a book that's called Truth versus Justice, amazingly, as if we didn't have the obligation to both, and if the victims didn't have a right to both, truth and justice. Anyway, I don't think that debate is on as much now. And I do think that the debate has gone on to more practical aspects of how to do truth-seeking and truth-telling. And there, CONADEP also stands for some good practice, and in some cases improved upon over CONADEP. And I want to say, for example, the composition. Argentina chose to appoint to this Commission on the Disappearance of Persons some persons of high moral standing and well-known in the community who could not be suspected of either having supported the military or having supported the guerrillas. And I think Argentina was fortunate that there were people like that. Mostly the chair of the commission, the writer Ernesto Sabato, who was very well known, not only in Argentina but throughout the world, especially in the Spanish language, for having written some marvelous pieces of literature, but also a person who had spoken out on issues of public interest generally. Some people criticized him because early on he had made some statements in favor of the military government, while at the same time seeking the release of some of his colleagues who were literary figures who had been caught and apprehended by the military. And so, but I think in fact he may have been a little naive in those early years, but he was not acting in bad faith. And so when he was appointed, he did provide the CONADEP with a sense of moral standing and respect that the public really appreciated. Of course, there are friends of mine who don't agree with that, but I do feel that he did it. And it was not only him, just about every other member of the commission, you know, participated of that kind of profile. And also the commission was very good about hiring staff. They literally hired staff from the human rights movement that by then in Argentina was relatively strong already. So one of the main writers of the report, who nominally, she was not a member of the report of the commission, but was appointed nominally secretary for drafting, was Mrs. Fernandez Mejide, who later became a political figure, but at that time was the mother of a 17-year-old disappeared person. And she had been very vocal and very active on disappearances. But she was also known to be very sensitive. Not a member of Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, but more acting on her own. And she represented the kind of people that they hired to do the investigation. And the other thing is about the methodology. Fortunately, practice over the years has improved upon what they did. But because, for example, they took testimonies in writing, but they did not hold hearings or things like that. In contrast, first, and by the way, the CONADEP took testimony mostly to provide lists, but also to illustrate general patterns. But they did not, the truth that the CONADEP sought and revealed was a general truth, a pattern truth rather than individual cases. And in fact, that's what they were charged with doing. And if you read the report, it's clearly premised on individual cases are going to be more clearly explored in the second stage when there's going to be prosecutions. So we are using these testimonies as illustration, but we are mostly trying to determine a pattern. In the Chile Truth Commission, the REDIC Commission it's called, they actually tried to come up with what they called individual truths. And of course the numbers were much smaller in Chile than in Argentina, but it was an improvement in the sense that it was a commitment to give each victim or each family of victim what they deserved in terms of truth, and not just society at large. Then further improvements were the South African Truth Commission, in that it held hearings, and made very public hearings, and gave a podium to victims and their families to be able to have for the first time access to tell their stories. And that methodology was adopted also by the Peruvian Truth Commission that ended its work in 2002, that also held hearings all over the country and gave a forum to victims that had until then, and especially in Peru this was very important because most of the victims were from the highlands where they had been ignored by the rest of the country for years, and being able to have a say before a national commission was an incredible breakthrough for them. So that's the kind of thing that the CONADEP didn't do, that later practice has shown to be important to do as well. But I think the most important good practice that emerges out of CONADEP is the report itself. A Truth Commission report is valuable if it brings out new evidence. If we know after the Truth Commission report more than we did before the Truth Commission was appointed. Unfortunately, in some examples, that has not been the case. For political or other reasons, there have been interferences, and either a report was never published or the report didn't really give us a lot more than we knew. But in general, the reports do bring out more information, and especially more systematic information. Because when, at the end of a period of massive or systematic repression, there's so much unknown, especially if the practice of disappearances has been part of the practice, that it's very important to come up with strong facts and hard facts, and especially facts that can lead you to establish responsibility. Now, one thing that the CONADEP report didn't do was identify individuals. And it's interesting that they had lots of names. But again, names on the basis of testimonies of the victims, who happened to know who was their torturer, or who was in charge of the place where they were held, etc. But that's very limited evidence, to say the least. And so the government decided, in fact, the executive branch put pressure on the commission not to reveal names. And the NGOs who had access to the same information, mostly because of the methodology that I just told you, they immediately put out a document, basically saying these are the names that the CONADEP had. And it's mostly just for public knowledge. Now, I think it was a good decision not to have officially put the names there, especially because at that time there was a prospect of prosecutions. And you don't want to jeopardize prosecutions by making it look like you're already condemning ahead of time. So this debate about whether to name names or not then raged on in other countries. And for example, the Truth Commission in El Salvador that was sponsored by the United Nations did name names. And it was very heavily criticized, and I think accurately, because in fact they named the names that they had, but they had only 6 months to work, so they didn't, the universe of possible culprits was very different, very large, much larger. And so there seemed to be a sort of selectivity in naming some names but not other names. Now that commission decided to do it because they felt that there was not going to be any prosecution afterwards. And they felt therefore that their truth would be incomplete if they didn't also include the names of the people that they had, at least prima facie, determined that they had some responsibilities. Nowadays, I don't think truth commissions debate whether to name names or not, because by and large we understand that truth commissions are not jurisdictional in nature and that they should not name names, because even naming is already a form of stigmatization that should be associated with a fair criminal process, not a fact-finding endeavor. On the other hand, if you're not going to have any kind of prosecution in the future, then there is an argument to be made that if you don't name the names that you have, then the truth that you're revealing is only partial. So, of course, ideally, truth commissions should not name names, and the name should only be revealed after a criminal process. But it does depend on whether you really have the conditions for a criminal process or not. I think the other thing in which CONADEP was also very helpful in drafting these lists of the disappeared, which have been, and coming up with almost 9,000 names. It helped establish a basis, a database, to begin to pay reparations that were paid later on, a few years later. But it was criticized, it was actually misused a few years later, because people say, well, that's the universe. That, it's not true that there were 30,000 disappeared. There were only 8,900 or something. Well, a couple of things. One, obviously, in 8 months, the commission was dependent on people coming forward. They didn't go looking for disappeared. And two, it is possible that families at that time either were still afraid, not very likely, because if 9,000 families are not afraid, why would another 1,000 be afraid? But some of them could, or even more likely, had just given up, and they didn't find it useful to do the CONADEP. And interestingly, the government of Alfonsín created an organ within the Ministry of Justice to follow up on CONADEP. And it's still there. It's called the Secretariat for Human Rights of the Justice Department. And the first thing they did in follow-up was to continue to gather more names. So in only a couple of years, the list went to about 11 or 1,200. And perhaps it's even larger now. But the most important thing is that this list, or these names, are the people who have yet to be found. So if somebody had been disappeared, but then released or reappeared, he or she is not on the list. And if the person had died and the corpse had been recovered, that person is not on the list either. So if you count what I would call temporary disappearance, people who are held for a while and then either passed on to the general circuit of regular detention or released, then it's likely that the numbers, including permanent disappeared and temporary disappeared, could well go past the 20,000 mark. Now, I for one don't think we can sustain the figure of 30,000 that the Argentine human rights movement has continued to this day to use. And this is sometimes anathema. If you say this in Buenos Aires, some of your best friends will say that you're betraying the disappeared. And I'm sad to say that because it shouldn't be that way. But I do think that the number probably is a little lower. And there's nothing wrong with having used a figure of 30,000 at a time when we had so little information to go on, but clinging to a figure just because it was what we said in the past doesn't seem to me to make that much sense. Nevertheless, you know, when General Videla, before dying, he said, no, it's only 7,000 because that list is wrong. You know, it's almost sad to see an old man saying we only killed 7,000 people, as if every one of those Argentines who disappeared was not important to the rest of us, as if it's relatively less serious to disappear 7,000 people than 30,000. To me, it doesn't make any sense. I know there's a lot more that can be said about truth-telling, and I'm always relating it back to CONADE because that I think is what you asked me to do. But maybe it's best to open up here now and let you ask questions or give me comments.
And you could identify yourself as well and introduce yourself before you ask a question.
Yeah, Sabur, I'm very interested to hear about your personal experience about your detention and torture and after your release and exile, and how did you start to be a human rights activist?
Good. Okay, it's not a very long answer. I mean, I became a lawyer in 1970 in Argentina. Don't ask how old I was then. It was a period of turmoil, so even before having my diploma, we were already working on matters of human rights. We were defending people who were arrested, trying to stop torture, etc. In 1974, I had to leave my hometown because it was dangerous for me there. I was arrested in my hometown, but only for 3 days. But then it was clearly I couldn't do my work there anymore. So I went to Buenos Aires and I lived and did political activism in the suburbs of Buenos Aires for another year or so. And in August of '75, under the previous government of the military, the government of Isabel Perón, I was arrested, and at that time they did have the state of siege. So I was accused of car theft and carrying weapons, but a judge immediately dismissed that evidence and ordered my release within a week or so of being arrested. But because of the state of siege, I was held and under administrative detention without trial for a year and a half. I was taken to one of the prisons. Incidentally, some of the guards, officials of that prison have been now convicted of serious human rights abuses there as well. And I was there for a year and a half, and then because of international pressure, I was allowed to be sent into exile relatively early. I was not released in Argentina. I was literally escorted to a plane and expelled from my own country. And I couldn't return for like 7 years or so. And in those years, I came to the States and to Washington, and I started doing solidarity work first with Argentine prisoners and disappeared persons, and then I joined human rights organizations, and the rest of it is there. And when they arrested me, I was tortured. It was mostly the methodology that was part of the course for just about everybody. The Argentine police and military favored electric shock. They would, tie you down to a bed or to a table and apply what they call the picana, which is like a cattle prod, but it's not the cattle prod. The one that is used on cattle is a specific machine that is used for torture, and that you can regulate the voltage, etc. And beatings, of course, and that. Others were subjected to waterboarding. I didn't have that happen to me. And of course, women were, all of them, sexually abused. There was a women's prison close to where I was, and the relatives visited both of us, and so we exchanged information. And at some point, the women in that prison, the political prisoners, conducted like a survey, and I think something like 98% of them had been tortured by sexual abuse. Okay, and now in my case, I was never disappeared, or maybe I was disappeared for 3 or 4 days when they were, taking you from place to torture you, and they didn't tell the judge or the family where you were. But the pattern of disappearances really began with the military dictatorship. And I was very lucky because at the time I was a member of a small group of younger attorneys, because the better known defense attorneys some had been killed, and many of them had to go into exile, or they were just couldn't do the work anymore. So we were, presenting habeas corpus writs or denouncing torture here and there, but under conditions in which we try to keep a low profile. And you can imagine how difficult it is to do this work with a low profile. You literally had to go into the courthouse and run out of there before somebody came to pick you up. So it was very difficult. And of that small group, at least 7 are counted now among the disappeared, only because they were arrested like a year after me, when they had the disappearance patterns or methodology in place. So in a sense, I was lucky to be arrested at the time when their main methodology was torture and arbitrary detention, but not disappearance. Yes?
Do you feel that the more current governments of Argentina have done a good job in responding or commemorating the disappearances, 1977 and 1983, like either of the Kirchner governments, or what do you think the modern response is, or should be?
There is what I consider an unhealthy discussion going on today, and it's part of the real sad state of public policy generally in Argentina. The policy debates are really poor, very sectarian. Nobody gives an inch, and so there's a tendency, and I wouldn't identify it with any particular party or government, but there's a tendency to say, now we're doing it right. Everything that was done before us was wrong, wrong-headed, limited, cowardly, whatever. And the opposite is, when we did it back in the 80s, that was the right way to do it, and these guys now have appropriated this, and they make it a partisan issue. Unfortunately, both are partially right and partially wrong. I do believe that the policy of honoring the disappeared, paying reparation to everybody, prosecuting cases, overcoming the pseudo-amnesty laws, reforming the institutions as much as they have been reformed, not completely, but all of those are a state policy. They're not a partisan policy. And it would be good if we could all say, yeah, we all agree with this. And in fact, the polls show, and have been showing literally since the 80s and without any serious change, that 75-80% of the population are in favor of this. So why is it a partisan issue? It beats me, quite frankly. I think, in fact, it has to do with what I said. The shrillness, the harshness of the debate. That for in other areas it could be more justified, but when it comes to human rights policy, it shouldn't be. I hope at some point that this is not going to be a problem, because my fear is that it may delegitimize the process of accountability for human rights violations if people end up identifying it with a political party. I don't think we're there yet, but the trend could be in that direction. And of course there's more resistance now, mostly because now it's serious. People are going to jail, and so and because the trials affect everybody. They go, and I think rightly so, they go not only to the top, but also to people who played some other roles, like the torturer himself, or the prison guard, or the local police officer. but also civilians, prosecutors and judges who didn't do their job correctly during the dictatorship, if there's evidence against them. And this is important. This is not a witch hunt. They do go after people to whom they have evidence. Now, they may not succeed in getting convictions, but they do respect the minimum evidence required for each case. But the more that you prosecute civilians, the more that the circles of support for ending the trials expand. They expand a bit. They don't expand much beyond this 20% that has always been there, that reject the trials. But they expand, and it becomes more vociferous in the press, especially the press that for other reasons are against the Cristina Fernandez and Kirchner government. They start, airing some of the criticisms of the policies. But at this point, I still believe that all of these different ways of dealing with the past enjoy great support in Argentina. Whether it's sustainable in the long run, who knows? I hope that's what you were asking.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes.
I have two questions. The first one concerns what you said, that you believe that there is no longer a debate between to have truth and to do justice. And I was wondering how you see the fact that, actually to have all the information of what happened during a military coup or a dictatorship, in kind of way you have to deal with amnesties at a certain point inside the commissions. And when we study our end of dictatorship in Spain and the actual democracy, they always tell us that it was an example of a successful transition, but actually now that I have studied many other transitions, I think that it's not all the case. And I was wondering, what do you think that the society needs to take the step to deal with past crimes, and why it was successful in Argentina and why it's not the case in Spain?
Yeah. Well, I think what I said about truth versus justice never really applied so much to Argentina, but to other episodes that came later, like South Africa, like Chile, even in Salvador, because at the end, right after the report, the government, the conservative government of El Salvador, issued a general amnesty, and they've never been able to prosecute anybody.
Or Guatemala as well.
Well, in Guatemala, the law was not a blanket amnesty. So theoretically, it left open the possibility of prosecutions. And that was because the United Nations insisted. The United Nations brokered the peace agreement in El Salvador and in Guatemala. And in both cases, the United Nations opposed blanket amnesties. Now, a separate question is, well, if you can prosecute, but do you? And yes, you're right. In Guatemala, they haven't prosecuted, except for this failed case against Rios Mon. There haven't been any political will to prosecute, but it's not a legal impediment, whereas in El Salvador it is. Anyway, the question was, in the face of this legacy of abuses, is it best to tell the truth and to forego justice, or is it best to do justice and or should we try to do both as much as possible? And the debate has sometimes been more rich and less rich, depending, because some people say the truth is the most important thing, because the society has to know what it did and what was done in their name. But it's also important to as an obligation that we have to the victims and to their families. But that doesn't mean that you don't prosecute. The people who say that the truth is more important generally tend to say, and we should do prosecutions as much as we can get away with, but don't insist on it, because it's a lot more complicated. And so if we have to live with a certain impunity, as long as we tell the truth and we do it in detail, the whole truth, then that's best. I never agreed to that. I always thought that both truth and justice and reparations and institutional reform were all part of a package that the state has to pursue in good faith and independently one of the other. But of course, there are obligations of means, not of results. So if you don't get all the whole truth, or if you don't prosecute everybody for a variety of reasons, that doesn't mean that the state is not living up to its obligations. Now, on your second question, I think the international law standards basically have evolved to saying the victims have a right to the truth and to see justice done. Now, in the case of Spain, because the majority of these victims are from the early years of the dictatorship, there isn't anybody to be prosecuted anymore. They're all dead, or almost all dead. So actually the victims are only looking to find the graveyards where that are still clandestine, where they were held. The working group on on disappearances estimated that next to Cambodia, Spain is a country that holds the largest number of clandestine graves. And it's so far in the past that we forget. Something like 180,000 or so, they estimate, are not accounted for. And not just from the war, but also from the early years of the dictatorship. So, if you ask me, yes, the Spanish government has to allow exhumations and to conduct serious investigations to be able to return the remains to their families. Even though now their families are grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they still should do that. In fact, I think there's a good argument that they are bound by international law to do it. In many countries, the obstacles are amnesties, and in Spain there is an amnesty, certainly, but there's also kind of a societal or cultural apprehension to deal with the past. And sometimes it gets a little scary, right? Because after all, all these people are looking for is, trying to find out where the remains of their loved ones are and be able to give them a decent burial. So if you're not going to prosecute anybody, why do we even say that the amnesty is a problem? I mean, for me, amnesties of a general blanket nature are now clearly prohibited under international law. And you can say, well, in those years they weren't, or the emerging standard cannot be applied retroactively. That's a different debate. But if they do exist, they should have a limited legal effect. And the limited legal effect of an amnesty is that someone gets not to be prosecuted. But using the amnesty to prevent the truth from being known as well doesn't seem to me to make any sense, because if a law violates an international standard, the obligation, and this I borrowed from a Supreme Court decision here in the United States, the obligation is to understand the law as much as possible in compliance with international law. And so it's important for courts to give limited legal effect to amnesty laws if they have them.
We have time for one more question. I have one question. And so you had mentioned the dilution of the truth versus justice debate, which did occupy the field for a long time, in sometimes, as you mentioned, quite artificial ways. So where do you see the field of transitional justice going? What are the sort of the big...
confronted with a legacy of widespread or systematic abuses, to investigate, prosecute, and punish, to reveal the truth, to offer reparations, and to reform the institutions so that they're not the vehicle for future violations. Mm-hmm. That is what we call transitional justice now, for lack of a better word, quite frankly, because it's not a very good terminology. But and I think I will say later, on what basis I say that these are established standards, on the basis of decisions by several different courts and other treaty bodies, but also accepted, I think, by the international community in a variety of ways. Now, so I think now the debate is, well, if a state has that obligation, how does it fulfill it in terms in which trying to fulfill that obligation can result in ongoing conflict, for example, or doesn't really, or prosecuting not only does not prevent human rights violations from happening, but in fact can be the trigger for new violations. And that debate is sometimes, again, shorthand, called peace versus justice. And it becomes really strident when the justice is being dispensed by an international body. But it is really not much different from the debates that we had early on in the transitions from dictatorship to democracy, in that the argument for those who cautioned against accountability was that you insist too much on justice and you're going to lose democracy. So you actually have to choose. Do you want democracy or do you want justice? And in fact, that stark choice was literally made in Uruguay by President Sanguinetti, the first democratically elected government, when he had to try to fight off a request for a referendum that in fact he succeeded in stopping. He actually told people, you want democracy or you want justice, because you can't have both. And that is a choice that I don't think international law now would allow. Because democracy and justice, and now peace and justice, are both values that we are supposed to support and to try to fulfill as much as possible. Now, when they enter into conflict, then you have to figure out, and unfortunately there are no clear recipes for this, and it does really depend very much on the circumstances on the ground. What do? You prosecute, which means, for example, rebel forces will not give up their weapons because they're not going to sign a piece of paper if it means that they are marched off to jail. Or do you accept anything that they claim as that they want to be giving to them in exchange for giving up the fight, even if it's a very unfair peace, even if it leaves a lot of open wounds in society. And quite frankly, I think that in international peacemaking, the standards have moved a bit, in the sense that there's especially after the creation of the International Criminal Court, there's a sort of a new paradigm that yes, you seek peace and you try to persuade people to give up the fight, but not in conditions in which you accept their blackmail, because the blackmail is basically not only we'll go on fighting unless you give us amnesty, and not only amnesty, but a house by the lake and perhaps a ministry, etc. But the worst is that they are saying, not only we're going to go on fighting, we're going to continue to chop the limbs of children, kidnap young girls for sexual slavery. We're going to continue to do all these violations unless you give us safe haven. And quite frankly, I think we've moved away from that, or we are moving away from that. Because unfortunately, this debate comes up every time there's a possibility of peace. And I think it's moved in the sense that nowadays peace negotiations never happen solely between the state and the insurgents, or the parties to the conflict, to say it in another way. They almost always engage, and especially if there are mediators involved, they try to bring in at least the voices of the victims, the voices of the population that has been affected by the conflict, if not on a decisive way, at least to be heard. And that generally tends, on the one hand, to make negotiations much more difficult, certainly, but also to get to a point where the solution at least has a better chance of being a long-standing peace, because it consults the rights and the interest of everybody and not just of the people who have the weapons. So I don't think the debate is ended by any significant mean, but I think we have evolving standards and evolving practices.
Well, Ian, it's been an extraordinary privilege and pleasure to have you here at the law school, Professor Méndez, and I ask everyone to join me in thanking you.